Hey Zach.
Hey Ronald.
How's it going?
I'm good.
Now, I understand you have some questions related to judgments.
I do. Now, what exactly in a broad spectrum is a judgment?
Well, a judgment is where a creditor sues you for some kind of debt that they allege that you owe them. The most obvious example I could think of is let's say you have a credit card debt, it's $10,000, let's say it's any one of the major vendors, and you made payments for a while, you were making the minimum payments, and then you stopped making the payments, they started calling you, you didn't make the payments for whatever reason, and now they're not happy.
Right.
Their remedy, since they're considered an unsecured creditor, is that they have to sue you to get a judgment against you. So what they do is they issue a summons and a complaint, which is hailing you into a court to answer their complaint, saying you owe the money, what do you say about that? And then that puts you in a situation where you have to contemplate your options, which could be filing for a bankruptcy, it could be filing an answer, contacting them and working out a deal, something to that effect. So a judgment is something that they are starting a lawsuit to try to take you to court to get a judge to provide an order that says that creditors owed the money. That's what they're trying to accomplish.
Okay. Now, going off of that, what exactly is a default judgment?
If you don't show up and you don't respond at all to the summons and the complaint, they could go to the judge and say, listen, judge, here's proof that we served this guy. This guy didn't respond in any manner, so we want a default judgment against them. So they must be guilty because they didn't respond. And the judge will go along with it. And they'll say, okay, you owe the $10,000 or whatever it is, and now there's a default judgment that's rendered against you. That default judgment then gets registered into a copy sent to the county clerk, and it becomes part of the public record. And if you own a piece of real estate, that could actually act as a lien against your real estate. So down the road when you go to try to sell the house, that clocks at 9% interest per year. That's a statutory interest percentage number. So 10 years at 9% interest on $10,000, that's going to grow. And then you're going to have a rude awakening when it comes time to sell, because the buyer's attorney is going to ask questions about this judgment that's against your property.
Right. Now, I also heard that if a judgment is passed on you, your bank accounts can be frozen and you won't be able to deposit money or withdraw money.
That is one of the goals of the credit card company when they're looking to get the judgment. They don't have the power to do those sorts of things, freezing bank accounts, without the court giving it to them. So what they do is they go to the court, whether you show up or not. If you don't show up, it's the default judgment. If you show up and you fight and you lose, they get a judgment that says you owe the money. So at that juncture, they're not really much better off because, okay, I know you owe the money and you haven't paid the money. So that gives them the power to go to the sheriff's department and say to the sheriff, listen, sheriff, I need some help. I have this judgment that says that this guy owes some money and I need to take some enforcement mechanisms. And one of those enforcement mechanisms is to go and freeze bank accounts that have your social security number on it. A common question people ask me is this happens and then they come to me and then they say, oh, they just froze my bank account, what can I do? Or even worse, they say, I had a joint bank account with my mom, my sister, my uncle, my brother, and the joint bank account now froze the other person's money that was in the account.
So it's all frozen.
Yeah, so they're not happy about that. But the truth is that if your social security number is on the account, the creditor can cause that kind of freeze. And they can actually freeze that account for twice the amount of the judgment. So for example, if it's $10,000, they could freeze that account to $20,000.
Wow. Now, I also heard something about wage garnishments related to judgments. How do they relate?
A wage garnishment would be, let's suppose that you didn't have any bank accounts under your social security number and the creditor with the judgment couldn't come after you in any manner to freeze bank accounts and get the money. They're not left without remedy. Another technique that they would use is they would try to garnish your wages. A lot of times, a lot of people don't know this, but on your credit record, oftentimes it says who your employer is. So now they know, okay, we know where you work. So they would use the sheriff, they would go and get the power to send a notice to your employer that says we want to garnish this person's wages. And they could take up to 10% of your gross wages, most creditors. The IRS can actually go after more. But for the most part, for credit card, that they go after up to 10% of your gross wages, and then that gets taken out before you even get your paycheck. And I get a lot of phone calls from people where this has happened, and they're all ticked off. Number one is now their employer knows what's going on. Someone's after them for some money. And number two, now 10% less of their paychecks coming in for other bills that they've deemed to be more important than the credit card debt.
Right. Now, my last question for you is, What about repossessions? We hear about them all the time on the news. What do they have to do with judgments?
Well, the when the creditor has gotten to the point where they've sued and they've gotten that judgment, whether it be a default judgment or a regular judgment, if it's a, let's say it's a lender that's trying to come after a car, like you did, let's say you did car financing and you stopped making the payments on your car, the lender would want to repossess the car because that's where they have their security. Either you're not making the payments, so they have the right to repossess the car. So what they'll do is they can't just do it because you haven't made payments. They have to get the right to do it. So they start the suit. It's determined that you're not making the payments. You don't have a good reason for not making the payments, or you don't show up in court. They get the judgment. They go to the sheriff. They have to pay an extra fee for this, but they actually can have the sheriff send out someone to impound the car, and they'll take the car back. Then what they do is they take the car and they sell it in an auction, and then whatever they get for the car, let's say you owed $10,000, and let's say they auction the car and they get $6,000. The $10,000 minus $6,000 is a $4,000 deficiency. They can actually chase you for the $4,000 deficiency after the fact. So you lost your car, it got sold for a fraction of what it was due, and they can come after you for the money. So in all of these circumstances that you're describing, it's always best to consult legal counsel in advance to see if you can either work out a deal or see if you can do some kind of bankruptcy to thwart these types of things, or at minimum maybe file an answer and use that to kick off some kind of negotiation. There's a lot of things that can be done, and it's usually better to do that earlier in the stages as opposed to after. You don't want to call me after your bank account's frozen. You want to call when you see it coming.
All right. Well, this is all great information, Ron. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.